Hey, vinyl community, as I film this very, very, very minute, it's the Easter long weekend. So if I decide to upload this and it's still the Easter long weekend, I want to wish everyone a great long weekend. I hope you've had time off work. I hope you've had time to play music. And if it's not the long weekend and you're watching this in 2026, well, I hope you're having a great day if the world's still around and it hasn't blown up or YouTube hasn't collapsed on itself. I want to say cheers to everyone. I'm too lazy to make coffee this morning. You're getting a Mandarin Orange Diet Coke, so I'll be extra annoying drinking out of a can. I apologize for that. This is the morning after I DJ'd. And trust me, this will all play into this video. I'll tie it all together like I always do. I DJ'd last night, so I've had about 3 hours sleep. In fact, I'm wearing the same clothes as I DJ'd in. I just kind of came home and passed out. But I woke up this morning and everyone in this house buggered off on me. So I have a block of time and I thought I would film this video. So if I have any errors, everything I'm going to tell you about these albums are just right here. So that combined with 3 hours sleep, I might make the odd factual error. So you have to excuse me on that one right away. So what this video is, by the way, if the description didn't tell you, this is more or less a continuation from my last video. My last video being 11 albums that I feel deserve reinvestigation. Albums that don't get a lot of love in the vinyl community. Or albums that if you were to believe critics, and really, why are you believing critics? Don't ever. Don't believe Amazon reviews. Don't believe critics. If you were to believe a critic, they might be an artist's lesser album. And these are albums that I would die on that hill for. They could be albums that play a part in my life. There could be a moment in time. There could be albums that I just intensely love, etc., etc. So if you've not seen that last video, just go back. It's one video back, and it'll add context to this one. And the 11 I showed you last video, that was kind of an arbitrary number. That's kind of what I had time for. So the albums I'm going to show you today, they were really intended for that video, and I just ran out of time. So this is definitely not a lesser pile. Any one of these albums could have been in that video. So there you go. I hope I set this video up in typical long fashion like I do. We're going to get right to this. And I'm going to try to be as brief as possible talking about these albums, as to try to cram in as much as I can. As fate would have it, the last video was 11. And before I pressed record, I counted, and this is 11. Last time I went to school in 1922, 11 and 11 is 22. So I somehow I just randomly pulled 22 albums when I wanted to make this video. Maybe in 2026, 11 and 11 won't be 22 anymore, possibly. I don't know what the world's going to be. I hope the world's still around. I hope I'm still alive. Public Image Limited album. If you don't know Public Image Limited, it is the band that John Lydon formed after the Sex Pistols. And this album is from about 1986, I want to say. And this album has their biggest hit called Rise. But unfortunately, the rest of the album is kind of forgotten about and kind of marginalized. It's very cool in the vinyl community. Actually, as luck would have it, there's one right here. It's very cool to name check albums like this, their second album, or as it was called, Metal Box in other parts of the world, or their first album, or Flowers of Romance. But when it gets into that mid 80s, early 90s Public Image Limited, it's not the coolest thing to kind of talk about those albums. Or not, it's not that it's not cool, it's just people don't. And I want to defend this album. The whole theme of the whole album, by the way, is generic. If you've seen the movie Repo Man, this whole album will make sense. And the CD was called Compact Disc, and the cassette was called Cassette, and the poster promoting this album was called Poster, if you get what I'm talking about now. But what they did on this album was, this was produced by Bill Laswell. Very, very well-known, very influential producer. And Public Image Limited had a touring lineup leading up to the making of this album that was going to record this album. And Bill Laswell and John Lyon decided to fire that whole band, and for good reason, because that touring lineup really wasn't very good. If you see live material, the album before this, This Is What You Want, This Is What You Get, that touring lineup was not very good. So what they decided to do to save money recording, and to make the album a little bit more dense, and just to speed the process up, they hired studio musicians. And what they got for this album was they had Steve Vai, of all people, and they had Ginger Baker from Cream, and they had an incredible jazz drummer named Tony Williams, who played with Miles Davis, who played with every known jazz artist of the 50s and 60s and 70s and beyond. So they went into the studio and they made this album. Like I said, the song Rise, most people know that song. What most people don't know is the rest of the album is actually better than Rise. They made this incredibly hard-sounding album with Steve Vai playing guitars. There's a touch of metal. But the key thing about this album is Ginger Baker. The drums, and that's what got me when I was a kid, is that the drum sound was amazing, and I had no idea who Ginger Baker was back then. The drums just explode out of your speakers, and it's amazing. And like I said, to me, Rise is maybe the lesser song on the album. My favorite song on this album, anyways, I don't know what more I can tell you about it. It's kind of things that you have to listen to. It's the hardest album that Public Image Limited ever made, maybe up there with This What Is Not, another album that not a lot of people know about. One of my favorite songs of all time is on this album. It's called Home. But there's songs like Ease and Bags and the opening track FFF. We're doing one take today, by the way, and I've had 3 hours sleep. So you're going to get mumbling today, too, as bonus content. FFF. Anyways, Public Image Limited album. Those 3 songs, investigate those if you want. Home, Ease, and FFF. We're going to go to the Knack. That band right behind me there. Their second album, But the Little Girls Understand. This album was deemed a commercial failure, but still went many times platinum. Go figure that one out. It's a failure in comparison to their first album, which to me is one of the most tight, perfect albums of all time. There's a really good documentary out there called Getting the Knack, which I highly recommend, and I've seen 100 times at least. And it kind of puts this album into context. Doug Feiger, they were on a roll, and he was intent on getting this album out and riding that wave. Their record label, on the other hand, wanted them to wait, and Doug Feiger got his way. And I think at that point, if you watch the documentary, the world was sick of the Knack. They were just everywhere, and they rushed this album out. And as I understand it, all the songs from this album were recorded around the time of the first album, or the songs were done. They were in demo form. And apparently, if you believe Doug Feiger, Get the Knack was supposed to be a double album, comprising that first album and this album. Anyways, that's a short story long. But as much as this album is deemed a commercial failure, and people who think of this as a lesser album are the people who believe critics. I believe anyways. It's not as good as the first album, but it's not far off of that album. Unfortunately, like I said, people by this point had just got sick of the band. But it has Baby Talks Dirty, which is kind of the content of the song is, I think Doug Feiger was he was taking the piss a bit, being a little, you have to listen to the song to know what I'm talking about. But there's songs like I Want Ya, Can't Put a Price on Love, Having a Rave Up, great song. Anyways, I'm gonna talk about this album, or I'm going to recommend this album needs a reinvestigation by some people as an album that's, like I said, not as good as the first album, but it's not far off of the first album. One of power pop's best forgotten albums, in my opinion. The Knack, But the Little Girls Understand. And in fact, a little trivia note for you. This girl here, that's Sharona from My Sharona. That's her. Which Doug Feiger wrote almost all the songs on the first album about, and I'm going to guess a lot of the songs on this album are written about her. That's Sharona. All right. We're going to go to a band called Suede. And this is Suede's second album, Dog Man Star. And I think if you live in the UK or in Europe, this album isn't as forgotten about as it is in North America. In North America, Suede had a modicum of success. Their first album did really well. And their second album did okay. But it's arguably their finest hour is this album, Dog Man Star. I'm not sure even like how to describe this album. With songs like We Are the Pigs, and I'm going to recommend that song if you want to know more about this album, We Are the Pigs. This album is maybe one of the best albums recorded in that Britpop era. Although Suede really wasn't considered a Britpop band, they were kind of precursor to that. An album that's as good as any album that ever came out in that era. I would put it up against any Blur album, any Verve album, any album, in my opinion. Anyways, Suede, Dog Man Star is the second album I want to kind of encourage you all to reinvestigate. See, I'm feeling like I'm being a little bit too scant now with details, but I'm hoping just showing the albums will kind of justify maybe people to kind of sampling it. Anyways, ACDC, and you're probably wondering how can I show an album that, ACDC's everywhere. But this album here, Flick of the Switch, it's considered one of their lesser albums, but yet it's better than any album they've put out in the last 20 years. If I recall my chronology correctly, this came out after For Those About to Rock, and which came after Back in Black. So they were riding that wave of Back in Black success, and For Those About to Rock was fairly big. And this album came out, and a lot of people deemed it a bit of a stinker. And to this day, it doesn't get a lot of play, it doesn't get a lot of love in the vinyl community. But I will say, post Back in Black, it's probably one of their best albums that they've done. What the band did is they wanted to get... they had been working with Robert Mutt Lang. And if you know that producer, you'll know he's very, very meticulous. And they wanted to get to a back-to-basic sound. So they kind of just went into a studio and plugged it in and played live. And it's a very raw album. But I will put the songs Flick of the Switch and Nervous Shakedown and This House is on Fire and Guns for Hire up against anything post Back in Black, in my opinion. So if you don't know this album, or if you thought this was maybe a lesser AC/DC album, I really encourage you to listen to Flick of the Switch again. Oddly enough, I play this more than Back in Black. Maybe because I'm burnt out on that album. But if anything AC/DC, if I'm pulling an album from that kind of Brian Johnson era, I pull out this album. I think it's one of their finest albums. So, anyways, AC/DC, Flick of the Switch. We're gonna go to they're a metal band, but there was a period in time in the late 80s and 90s where there was hair metal. And there was kind of like pseudo biker metal, like Circus of Power and bands like that. But I'm going to talk about a band called Junkyard. Junkyard was one of those kind of, if you look at them, they kind of look like a bunch of badass bikers. Kind of like the Four Horsemen, like I said, like Circus of Power. Very bluesy rock, kind of rolled into metal. And oddly enough, if I remember right, right here is a Brian Baker. Brian Baker was in Minor Threat. And then he grew his hair long and was in this metal band. Some trivia for you there. Anyways, and I think he went on to play with Bad Religion, oddly enough. Anyways, Junkyard. One of the best metal albums of that genre that's not a full-out glam metal album. Very balls to the walls, very just basic rock album. Like I said, it's like a band you would go into a CD bar in 91 or so, and they'd be kicking ass, like I said. Anyways, Junkyard. And if I'm going to recommend a song, I'm going to recommend Blues. Yeah, and Hollywood. Hollywood was the single off the album, the big one people might know. But Blues is really good too, the first song on the album. Junkyard, first album. Incredible, great. I call it biker metal. I don't know what you all call it. Maybe you call it shit for all I know. Love Hate is the next album. Blackout in the Red Room. One of those albums that if you're heavily involved in the metal community, you'll know this album is one of the most underrated albums probably of that whole genre. If you're not familiar with that genre, Love Hate. This album. There's funky elements to it. Some of the best songwriting of that time for this genre. Anyways, Jizzy Pearl was the lead singer, and Jizzy Pearl went on to be the replacement singer in every metal band in the 2000s. I think he went on to be the replacement singer in Rat for a time, LA Guns, so many other bands. But this was his kind of main band, Love Hate. This, what was this from? I want to say 1990, around that. One of those albums that did respectably well, but it got released in that hair metal time when people just wanted makeup and big hair, and Love Hate came out and released this really weird hybrid metal funky album, and it's just fantastic. So if you don't know this album, I highly recommend Love Hate, Blackout in the Red Room. And if I'm going to recommend a song, I'll recommend the song Blackout in the Red Room. And I'm going to pick one more. Rock Queen, the first two songs on the album. I think they front-loaded this album. But Rock Queen, another really, really great song. Anyways, Blackout in the Red Room by Love Hate. An album that's not really so much forgotten. I guess it is forgotten, because I don't see it posted in the vinyl community a whole lot. It is absolutely... See, here's the thing. And now, this is where you're going to argue with me. It got lumped into the grunge thing. And they toured with Nirvana and all those bands. And I guess for all intents and purposes, they kind of, if you want to put it under that horrible banner of grunge. Excuse me. I will say, and I will go on the record as saying, I feel this album is just as good as any grunge album that came out in that genre, in that time. I think it's as good as Nevermind, In Utero, 10. Take your pick. Super Unknown. L7, Bricks Are Heavy. This is one of those albums where they caught lightning in a bottle. Their album before this, Smell the Magic? And their album after this, called Hungry for Stink, were very, very good albums. But this album, like I said, they caught lightning in a bottle, and everything came together, and they made this perfect album. And to me, this album is absolutely perfect for that genre. Even outside that genre, it's one of those albums where, I mean, show me a bad song on this album. It doesn't exist. I can go right down, and I'm not even going to recommend a song because you have to listen to this whole album. L7 were, I don't remember the history of L7, where they're from. But all-female band. And I don't know. I don't know what to say. I was going to recommend a song, but like I said, I would feel bad if I recommended one song because the whole album is absolutely perfect. And like I said, I will die on that cross, and I will defend this album. And encourage you to get this album, listen to this album. One of the most perfect albums to come out of the 90s, in my opinion. It's produced by Butch Vig. Obviously, we know Butch Vig. He's part of Garbage. He's the drummer in Garbage, but he went on to produce all those notable grunge albums. But I'm starting to think of words to talk about this album. It's just perfect. It's the perfect grunge album. As it was harder than most. It had, like I said, it had metal moments in it, I feel. And maybe that could be just the tonality of the guitars, of the vocals, etc., etc. Plus, you had all girls kicking ass as just as hard as any other male band. Anyways, L7, Bricks Are Heavy. To me, one of the best albums of the 90s. Maybe the best album of the 90s, in my opinion. I can't say enough good things about this album. All right. We're going to go on to The Damned. The Damned are one of my top 5 favorite bands of all time. I've been lucky enough to meet them. I've been lucky enough to kind of briefly hang out with Captain Sensible, one of my heroes. One of the most underrated guitar players of all time. I've been a disciple of The Damned since about '84. The album I'm going to talk about is an album kind of like Public Image Limited. It's kind of cool to talk about Machine Gun Etiquette in the first album. But then they kind of dropped this album in, was it 1980? It's called the Black Album. And here's the thing. The Damned were too good to be a punk band. They could play their instruments, and that was the kind of the knock on them. Is that, you know, in that 77, 76 era punk, they had these influences that they didn't want to tell you about. They did later on. They were heavily influenced by Syd Barrett and psychedelic music. And when the punk scene kind of died down, that allowed them to kind of come out and show those influences, which they did on this album. The Black Album, this is when they decided to go a little bit psychedelic. So you have punk mixed with psychedelic. And if you have the original album, that's the double album, you get a song called Curtain Call, which takes up a whole side of an album, which might be one of the greatest moments. This isn't a punk album. I hesitate to call this punk. But if we're going to throw it under a genre, Curtain Call is maybe one of the best recorded moments in punk, in my opinion. Anyways, I'm going to recommend a song. And if that kind of description makes sense to you or sounds appealing, it's, like I said, it's punk. A punk band, primarily, who were allowed to show their ability and their influences. And it's let's call it a trippy punk album. Listen to the song Curtain Call. It's long, but it's, like I said, it's one of the best recorded moments of that genre. And then we have Drinking About My Baby, Waiting for the Blackout, Sick of This, Sick of That. It has History of the World Part 1 and 2. Anyways, the Black Album, an album that in no way gets enough love, gets mentioned. It is a very highly regarded album, but like I said, I never see anyone talk about this album. And it's probably one of their best albums that they've ever done. And in fact, with Machine Gun Etiquette, I'm going to call it probably their best recorded moment, the Black Album. Anyways, listen to the song Curtain Call if you've got a lot of time on your hands. All right, we're going to get to this band called Sons of Freedom. Sons of Freedom were actually from Vancouver, Canada, but they got signed to Slash Records in LA. Slash Records was primarily a punk label, and then they went on to sign a lot of LA bands like X and I think the Bodines and bands like that. And I think L7 was on Slash, oddly enough. But this album did really, really well in Canada. And in fact, I just got an email from Rhino Records asking people to vote on their next batch of reissues, and this was part of it. So someone out there remembers this album, Sons of Freedom. One of my favorite Canadian albums of all time, Sons of Freedom, first album. You're going to hear dogs barking, by the way. We're dog sitting, more dogs, so just ignore that. Heavy alternative. Some funky moments, but don't let that scare you. It's an album you absolutely have to hear. And of all the albums I'm talking about today, if this is the album I would love people to investigate the most, is Sons of Freedom, first album. There's not a bad song on here, but if you listen to side 1, Super Cool Wagon, The Criminal, Mona Lisa, Dead Dog on the Highway, first 4 songs, find me an album of this genre, of this era, that has 4 songs back to back to back to back like this. It doesn't exist. Sons of Freedom, first album. Please have a listen. It's anyways, a really quick aside. I went to see the Tragically Hip on their, what was it, Fully Completely tour or Road Apples tour. They played an arena here, and Sons of Freedom opened up, and I went for these guys, and I left. I left before the Tragically Hip came on. I've seen them a lot of times, Tragically Hip. So I went to see Sons of Freedom and said, that's it. I'm out of here, because that's how much I love this band. Anyways. Now I feel horrible for walking out on the Tragically Hip. I saw that tour later on, but I love that band. Last album I'm going to talk about today is Billy Bragg, Talking with the Taxman About Poetry. And this contains one of my top 5 best or favorite songs of all time. And Billy Bragg very, very rarely gets featured in any vinyl community. I don't know if I recall a video. Maybe there is a video out there. I don't recall watching a video that talks about Billy Bragg at all. This was his 3rd album. And the song I'm talking about, one of my favorite songs of all time, is called Levi Stubbs' Tears. And at this point in Billy Bragg, in his career, it was just him. And he might have a trumpet player on like on Levi Stubbs' Tears. But it was basically just him playing an electric guitar and singing his songs. And he did a lot of songs about unions and about, inequality, with workers. He was a very strong advocate of the workers in the UK. Anyways, in labor strife and all that stuff. But you don't need me to talk about that. To me, this is his best album. Greetings to the New Brunette starts off the album. And a little bit later on, you get Levi Stubbs' Tears. Like I said, one of my favorite songs of all time. If you don't know Billy Bragg, I guess you have to be a little bit inclined to like that kind of stuff. Kind of solo guitar stuff. Electric guitar, it's not acoustic. But he has a sound all his own. And if you listen to the song Levi Stubbs' Tears, I hope, and if you've not heard it before, I hope you have a eureka moment like I did way back when. Anyways. Like I said, I was trying to be as scant as possible with details as not to make this go on too long. So if I was a little bit too scant, I apologize. What you got there was 11 more albums I feel doesn't get enough love in the vinyl community. Or sometimes they're lesser albums, if you were to believe those damn critics. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, as rushed as it was. I don't know if I made too many mistakes today. I think I was pretty spot on. Anyways, like I said in my last video, and I hope you've made it this far, is that sometimes with albums that you love so intensely, it's hard to put into words sometimes, or to form words of how you feel about an album. You're taking emotions in here, and you're trying to regurgitate them. And I find it hard sometimes to tell you why I love an album. I can describe the music, but anyways. So what I'm trying to get at is I hope I'm kind of more or less verbalizing or getting across what the album is and why I love it so much. But there you go. Anyways, we're going to end this video here. I want to thank you everyone for watching the last video and watching all my videos in general. See, dogs again. I may or may not be back with a Vinyl Finds video. I have not decided yet, so stay tuned. You never know. You never know. So from me, and 3 barking dogs upstairs, I hope you all have a good weekend, a good rest of the day, whatever it happens to be in your part of the world. Take care. We'll see you next time.